Hello, everyone. We are going to continue slowly reopening things according to the schedule that we've posted on our website. If you haven't yet seen that, check it out at beanblossomchurch.com/updates. We will keep that part of our website up to date with any new information that we need to get out there about what's going on or whatever else, or what's happening. So definitely check that out. You can check in regularly, or if you ever have questions, do feel free to call me or text me or email, whatever, anytime. So as far as the videos, we still have at least 2 more weeks of including your videos in the services. And first of all, I want to say a huge, huge thank you to all of you who have put those together. I know that's not always easy. Most of you who have done it, it's way outside of your comfort zone to do it. And they've been great. They've been absolutely wonderful. And we've gotten so many great comments of people just really being ministered to by you guys yourselves in those videos. So keep them coming. Even if we, in the next couple weeks, if we get way too many videos that we can possibly use in the next 2 weeks, that's great. I would actually love to continue showing these videos even in the future, even once we can start having more regular services. I know for some people it's a lot less intimidating to be able to record themselves on a video than to get up and in front of an audience and say something live, because you only get one shot live, whereas on a video you can always just say, I'll re-record that. So if you haven't yet done a video, even if it's way outside of your comfort zone, I encourage you, do one. We would love it. Or even if you have done a video already, consider doing another. We would love that. So again, send those to me. So for today, we've got a couple videos we'll show you now.
Hello, Bean Blossom family. I hope everyone is staying safe and staying well and staying strong in the faith during this time. First of all, I want to say thank you to everyone who's prayed for my mom over the last week and over the last year. A year ago, June 10th, she was rushed to the hospital. She quit breathing. She needed to be intubated, and she had pneumonia, and it turned into acute respiratory distress syndrome, and they had to put her in a coma. And while in that coma for 2.5 weeks, she had a stroke, and that stroke caused brain damage, and they didn't give her but 10% chance to live, but she lived, and she's been living in a nursing home here in Martinsville the last, my perception of time is awful, but I would say about 8 to 9 months, so she could be close to me and I could go see her. And she has slowly been recovering. She's gained range of motion, and we can understand her when she speaks a little bit better with her trach. But last week, she stopped breathing, and she had to be rushed to the emergency room, and they found that she had pneumonia again, and she was positive for COVID. So they moved her to Bloomington Hospital and put her on life support. And so I just want to, like I said, thank you for everyone who had knowledge of that and who's been praying for her and for us. I'm truly grateful. I feel the prayers of peace and just being able to trust that God is in control. And they said that she could potentially be extubated here in a couple of days, and they think that she's on the road to recovery to overcome COVID. So I'm super thankful to God for that, and just thank you. I wanted to share my testimony today for those who do not know. I'm 32 years old, and I'm from Brazil, Terre Haute, Indiana. They're about 20 miles from one another. And I am a wife of 5 years and a mother to 4 children, Shane, Kaylin, Solomon, and Zephaniah. I lived in heart addiction for 10 years. I was an IV meth addict from the age of 16 to 26. Obviously, that was a very hard life. My mother lived in addiction for a long time. She did 14 years in prison. My dad also lived in addiction for a long time. He did 12 years in prison. He got out in 2000 and 13 and was living at transitional housing, and he went out on a weekend pass and he overdosed and died on Father's Day. I had lost my children for 2 years to the state, and God had been trying to get my attention, but I was really angry and really hurt and abandoned, neglected, rejected, all those things that are so prevalent in the world. And so I was angry and I wouldn't listen. But on April 7th, 2014, I found myself at a Mission Bible Training Center. And so he picked me up out of that mess and he placed me in this place where I stayed for 11 months. And I got to know him, and where he saved and changed my life. And now I'm at 6 years sober, and I work at Centerstone in mental health and addiction, and I try to share the same hope with others that I have found as much as I am able. But I have a lot of opportunity to pray, and prayer is the most powerful weapon. So my husband's been sober for 5 years, and I got my kids back after 2 years, and I had 2 more. So I'm super blessed, and people say I'm a miracle, and I'm just so thankful for grace and favor. God is so good, and he's always had his hand on me, and I'm so thankful for that, and for him showing me love that I can extend to other people who maybe have never known any type of love or anything like that. So I'm just thankful for that time that I was at the Mission Bible Training Center, because I sought out the Lord with all my heart, and I even come to terms with the fact that if I never got my children back again, I had Jesus and he was all I needed. And once I surrendered everything, he really, really worked in my life and just showed himself so strong and so real. He saw it fit for me to have another chance at being a mother. I'm so grateful for that. And the opportunity that we have to train our kids up in the Lord and just lead the example that he would have us to lead, and give them the life they would not have had if he hadn't intervened. So anyone who struggles with family, children who are in addiction, you know Jesus, you know hope. Don't lose hope, and don't not show love, because so many people are lacking love, and God has shown us love to show love. And so that's like the key component to me, is love, walking in love, and just trusting in him through anything. But I was going to say, I'm so thankful for that time away to gain the solid foundation in him, to where life's storms come and I can stand firm in him and stay sober and know that he's got me. He's got this. He's for me. And if he's for me, who can be against me? He's shown that he's for me. So I need not worry about anything else. He's in control. He's faithful, and he's ever present. And so he can help us get through any situation. I said 6 years ago that no matter what situation I face in life again, I will never, ever, ever, ever curse God again, and I will never use drugs again. And I'm so thankful that I meant that, and I know that with his help, I never will. So there's hope to get through any circumstance, and just talk to him, reach out. Support is vital. And again, thank you all for your support. That has played a role in helping me maintain my sobriety. So thank you, and blessings to all of you. Continue to stay safe, continue to stay strong, and we love you all, and we'll look forward to when we can all get together again.
Jesus Christ, God's holy Lamb, we washed us in thy blood, made us kings and priests to God. Take this tribute of the poor, lest we can't give more. Souls redeemed, your voices raised, sing a dear Redeemer's praise. Worthy thou of love and law, King of saints incarnate God. Righteous are thy ways and true, endless honors are thy due. Grace and glory in thee shine, matchless mercy, love divine. We for whom thou once was slain, we thy ransom sinner train. In this one request agree, Spirit make us more like thee. Souls redeemed, your voices raised, sing your dear Redeemer's praise. Worthy thou of love and law, King of saints incarnate God. Souls redeemed, your voices raised, sing your dear Redeemer's praise. Worthy thou of love and law, King of saints incarnate God. King of saints incarnate God.
All right, today we are in Daniel chapter 6. This is the last narrative section of the book of Daniel where it's telling an event and giving the story of what happened. Beyond this, we then get into the apocalyptic style where it's talking about these different dreams and visions and things, especially things that are to come, that a lot of people really get excited about. So that's starting probably next week. But today we've got Daniel 6. This story that in Daniel 6 is actually a very familiar story for most people. It's a story that we frequently teach to children because it's a very amusing, kind of exciting story, a cool thing that happened. And yet, even though we so regularly teach this story to children, many adults don't yet grasp its real significance. It's a very significant story. It's a very powerful lesson that really each one of us needs to take to heart. So we're going to look at this familiar story and see not just what it's saying. That you probably know that already if you've been to Sunday school or grown up in the church. But we're going to look at even more, like, what do we take from this? What is this powerful lesson that the writer of this chapter is trying to emphasize and teach us that we really need to learn? So just to give you a little bit of a background to this, what we're about to read, before we even jump into reading it, if you remember what we covered prior to this, Daniel chapters 1 and 2 happened pretty early on in Daniel's life. He was probably a teenager soon after he's taken from Israel into Babylon. And then Daniel 3 happens sometime later, Daniel 4 later, Daniel 5 happens right at the very end. That's what we read last week. That happened at the very end of the Babylonian Empire, the very night that Babylon fell to this Medo-Persian Empire that came in. And now, in Daniel 6, this is soon after Daniel 5, but now this is the first story that's talking about the Persians now being in power, or this Medo-Persian Empire that is now in control. They are the new superpower of the world. And in a lot of ways, their power will actually go way beyond that of what even the Babylonians had. So at this point, now the Medo-Persian Empire is in power. Daniel, by this time, was a very old man, probably somewhere around 80 years old. We don't know his exact age, but he had to have been probably somewhere around 80, which at that time, 80 years old would have seemed older back then than what it would today. Today, we have a lot of people who live to be 80. Back then, it would have been less common. And so he would have been considered pretty elderly at that point in time. Now, he had a high position in the government again, now under the Medes and Persians. He had a very high position in the government under King Nebuchadnezzar of the Babylonians, but then after Nebuchadnezzar, it seems that Daniel kind of lost his position, was kind of pushed aside, and others replaced him, and it's kind of forgotten. until then at the very end, like as the Babylonian Empire was collapsing and coming to ruin, then he's suddenly elevated. And the Persians, they seem to kind of keep him around as like, well, yeah, we'll put him in power. And they like doing that to a large extent. If you've got someone who's well-trained and knows what they're doing, even if they're from a different kingdom, yeah, we'll put them to good use. So turn with me to Daniel chapter 6. Daniel chapter 6. And we're going to look at this familiar story and see what it is that we so often miss. What's the real significance of this story? So Daniel chapter 6, starting in verse 1, it says, "It pleased Darius to appoint 120 satraps to rule throughout the kingdom, with 3 administrators over them, one of whom was Daniel." Now, before we go any farther, I do want to address this question of who is this Darius guy. It's going to refer to him as Darius the Mede as we go into this farther. And this has actually been the subject of a lot of debate on who this Darius the Mede is. We don't see that name or title actually mentioned in other documents from ancient times. Only the Bible lists that title. And so people aren't totally sure who it's referring to. Some think that maybe Darius the Mede is the governor of that area, or the one who's ruling that local province. And there's some evidence to suggest that could have been the case. However, I think the strongest argument and the best evidence is that Darius the Mede is actually another name for Cyrus the Great, or Cyrus the Persian, as he's referred to many times as well. Now, you might be saying, well, that sounds weird. How can Darius the Mede be the same as Cyrus the Persian, right? First of all, I want to point out, it's not uncommon for people, especially powerful people, like kings or other leaders, to have more than one name or more than one title that they were referred to as. That was very common in those days. We see that in a lot of different places back and in fact, even in the book of Daniel, we see a lot of that. Daniel and his 3 friends were all known by 2 different names that are used interchangeably through the book of Daniel. But furthermore, Cyrus was actually, yes, he was Persian. He was also Mede. His dad was Persian, and that's why the Persians would refer to him as a Persian, because they would tend to consider someone's ethnicity to transfer through the father. But Cyrus's mother was actually a Mede, and not just any Mede. Interestingly enough, Cyrus's mother was, I guess you could say, the princess of Media. She was the daughter of the former king of Media. So Cyrus was of royal blood, of royal Median blood, that is, of course. So he was, yes, half Persian and half Mede. And from what we can tell, it seems that the Persians like to refer to him as a Persian, and the Medes like to refer to him as a Mede. That makes sense, obviously. And that's probably part of the reason that Cyrus had so much success in unifying both the Persians and Medes to join together in this one new Persian empire. Because both of them felt like, hey, we've at least got the Persians think we've got a Mede in control, Persians think we've got a Persian in control. The Medes say we've got a Mede in control, and they're both right, so they can all get along. And of course, Cyrus did a good job of including both Persians and Medes in the government as well. So anyway, both Cyrus and Darius seem to be titles rather than names, so it also makes sense that Darius the Mede would just be kind of a synonym to Cyrus the Persian. Of course, Medes and even the Jews who tended to trace ethnicity more through a mother than through a father, it would make sense that they would refer to him more by his Mede name, whereas, of course, Persians and others probably referred to more as by his Persian identity. Also, in Daniel 5:31, it mentions that Darius the Mede was 62 years old at the time that Babylon was conquered. There's one other ancient source that we have that talks about Cyrus's age, specifically at the time that he died. And when you figure out how those line up and put it historically all together, those line up really, really closely. And so it seems that this is quite likely the age that Cyrus would have been at that time. So again, more evidence that Darius the Mede could quite likely be Cyrus the Great or Cyrus the Persian. You'll see later on in this chapter, and part of the reason this is significant is because I think it draws a lot more significance if we realize that this Darius guy was not just some local leader, but this was Cyrus the Great, the guy who's well known throughout history books, and you've probably learned about in your junior high or high school history lessons or whatever, if you remember back that far. But yeah, this at the end of Daniel 6, you'll see it mentions, let's see, in verse 28, so Daniel prospered during the reign of Darius and the reign of Cyrus the Persian. Now some people say, well, that seems to be indicating that these are two different people. It mentions Darius and Cyrus. So isn't that two people? Well, the way that this is translated, it's not that clear in the original language. In fact, if you're using the NIV like I am, you'll notice that they have a footnote right there specifying that this passage could also be translated Darius, that is, during the reign of Cyrus. So that and actually in the Hebrew, all it is just one letter vav that's basically connecting these. It's like we would normally translate it and, but that word can also be translated like that is, or even this. You can kind of think of it also known as. And to give you another example, if you look at 1 Chronicles 5:26, it mentions Pul, king of Assyria, and then the letter vav, and then Tiglath-Pileser of Assyria. And Pul and Tiglath-Pileser, we know from other documents, that's the exact same person, two different names. And so it's like saying Pul, also known as Tiglath-Pileser. That same exact construction is what we see here in Daniel chapter 6, verse 28. It's Darius, then that letter vav, and then Cyrus. Or the reign of Darius, that is, the reign of Cyrus. So again, I think this is referring to the same person, just clarifying that Darius, who maybe some people might not know who's being referred to, they're just clarifying this is Cyrus. So anyway, that might be more information than you want to know, but there is one other piece of evidence that I think is probably the most convincing of all. There are actually 3 Jewish writings that come from many years later that actually tell the same story, but they change Darius to Cyrus. They make that edit and change it. So where you would normally expect to see Darius, like here in the story of Daniel, they actually change it to Cyrus, which would indicate that even the Jews from that time, they probably knew that by that time, centuries later, the name Darius wasn't as well recognized. Not everyone would have known that that was the same as Cyrus, and so they deliberately changed it to the more familiar name, Cyrus, so that everyone would know who this story was actually talking about. Again, I think that's very, very strong evidence that Darius and Cyrus are the exact same person, just 2 different names. One's a Median title, the other is a Persian title. So I'm going to assume that those are, we don't know this for 100% certainty, but I'm going to assume that Darius and Cyrus are the same person, because I think the evidence seems to point that direction. So anyway, Daniel chapter 6. Now imagine King Cyrus. He's now come to power, and he's ruling there, and yes, he did actually rule in Babylon as well. His winter palace, or his winter residence was there in Babylon, and it makes sense. He would, he had palaces back home in Persia as well, but Babylon was such an impressive city. Again, like before they conquered it, it was the most impressive city in the world, and there were multiple palaces in the city of Babylon that were so grand and incredible. Why wouldn't Darius just take them and use them for himself? It makes sense. So, and even according to other historical documents, it seems that he spent every winter there in Babylon, reigning from there, and then the rest of the year he'd go back to his home city. So, again, this fits with what we read here about Darius or Cyrus, being based in Babylon when this story takes place. So it says, please Darius to appoint 120 satraps, or basically different government officials, to rule throughout the kingdom, with 3 administrators over them, one of whom was Daniel. Now the satraps were made accountable to them so that the king might not suffer loss. Now Daniel so distinguished himself among the administrators and the satraps by his exceptional qualities that the king planned to set him over the whole kingdom. So not only was he one of the top 3 administrators, the king wanted to elevate him to number 1 of those administrators to oversee everything else. So it says in verse 4, at this, the administrators and the satraps tried to find grounds for charges against Daniel in his conduct of government affairs. But they were unable to do so. So they were probably jealous, or they probably wanted, maybe they thought if he's getting promoted to this higher position, now they're kind of a lesser promotion, or, especially they're trying to find charges against him. They can't find charges. It might be that they were corrupt officials. They're thinking, we don't want this honest guy in charge of us. We're going to be in trouble. I don't know what the case was, but for some reason they have it out for Daniel. They want to bring him down. And we'll see that they hatch a plot to do so. So it says, verse 4, they were trying to find grounds for charges against Daniel in his conduct of government affairs, but they were unable to do so. They could find no corruption in him because he was trustworthy and neither corrupt nor negligent. Finally, these men said, we'll never find any basis for charges against this man Daniel unless it has something to do with the law of his God. So apparently these guys knew he was very faithful to his God. It's interesting, his faith was very evident to these other officials. So verse 10, oh wait, sorry, we're not there yet. Verse 6, so these administrators and satraps went as a group to the king and said, and this is their plan of how they're going to get at Daniel, said, may King Darius live forever. Now the royal administrators, prefects, satraps, advisors, and governors have all agreed that the king should issue an edict and enforce the decree that anyone who prays to any god or human being during the next 30 days, except to you, your majesty, shall be thrown into the lion's den. Now, your majesty, issue the decree and put it in writing so that it cannot be altered, in accordance with the law of the Medes and Persians, which cannot be repealed. So, King Darius put the decree in writing. So it's interesting. They're coming up with this plan. They know, okay, this Daniel guy, he is so faithful to his God. He's never going to give up on that. So let's just make this decree. Everyone's got to pray to Cyrus. And, Cyrus is probably going to be okay with this. And it's probably not that they would have viewed Cyrus as a god. We don't really see evidence that from other sources or from the Bible necessarily that people would have viewed Cyrus as a deity himself, that people should pray to him. Quite possibly what this is, that it's like viewing him as this mediator, that like everyone pray to Cyrus, and then Cyrus, since he's so exalted of a human that he can be in communication with the gods or have the favor of the god, that essentially then he can use the power of the gods or whatever, or be kind of this intermediary or mediator or whatever between the gods and the people. But quite possibly it may have been kind of thought of as a little bit of a political stunt too, since he's like new in power over Babylon, and this is kind of a way of solidifying his power and trying to get people to trust him. But whatever the case, Darius went along with it. Probably thought, sure, sounds good, why not? Especially if what you guys say is true, that all the people in power, or all the different leaders in the kingdom are all agreeing to this, and sure, let's do it. Must be right. So verse 10, now when Daniel learned that the decree had been published, he went home to his upstairs room where the windows opened toward Jerusalem. 3 times a day he got down on his knees and prayed, giving thanks to his God, just as he had done before. So his practice of praying to God 3 times a day did not change. So then these men went as a group and found Daniel praying and asking God for help. So of course, they knew that he would be doing this, so they showed up and obviously caught him in the act. So verse 11, so verse 12. So they went to the king and they spoke to him about his royal decree. They said, Did you not publish a decree that during the next 30 days, anyone who prays to any god or human being except to you, your majesty, would be thrown into the lion's den? The king answered, the decree stands in accordance with the law of the Medes and Persians, which cannot be repealed. And yeah, that's an interesting thing. The law of the Medes and Persians could not be repealed. Once a law was made, it was final. It could not be overturned. It probably gave people assurance that laws aren't just going to be overturned at any moment, and that you can't trust what people are saying is law. But no, if it's law, it's for sure, and it will not be changed. So verse 13 says, then they said to the king, well, Daniel, who is one of the exiles from Judah, pays no attention to you, your majesty, or to the decree you put in writing. He still prays 3 times a day. Now, when the king heard this, he was greatly distressed. He was determined to rescue Daniel and made every effort until sundown to save him. So, the king had just promoted Daniel to be the one in charge because he knew of how reliable, trustworthy, and not corrupt Daniel was. He was a very good, reliable person. And so, obviously, he just promoted this guy. He likes Daniel, and he trusts Daniel. And so, obviously, he's not so happy about this. And it says here, he's trying to find every way possible to rescue Daniel. But the problem is he's made a law, and according to their law, once that law is made, it cannot be revoked. So, where are we at? Verse 15. Then the men went as a group. I think that's where we're at. Anyway. Then the men went as a group to King Darius and said to him, remember, your majesty, that according to the law of the Medes and Persians, no decree or edict the king issues can be changed. So the king gave the order, and they brought Daniel and threw him into the lion's den. The king said to Daniel, may your God, whom you serve continually, rescue you. So, in other words, Daniel's faith was quite evident to King Cyrus or King Darius as well. So a stone was brought and placed over the mouth of the den, and the king sealed it with his own signet ring and with the rings of his nobles, so that Daniel's situation might not be changed. Once something's sealed, you cannot undo that without basically putting your life in jeopardy. So it makes it for sure. That seal cannot be broken. So I'm sure the king was not happy about that. He didn't want to, but the law required it, and he had to keep that law that he had made. So verse 18, then the king returned to his palace and spent the night without eating and without any entertainment being brought to him. And he could not sleep. He was very disturbed, in other words. Now at the first light of dawn, the king got up and hurried to the lion's den. When he came near the den, he called to Daniel in an anguished voice, Daniel, servant of the living God, has your God, whom you serve continually, been able to rescue you from the lions? Daniel answered, may the king live forever. My God sent his angel, and he shut the mouths of the lions. They have not hurt me, because I was found innocent in his sight. Nor have I ever done any wrong before you, your majesty. The king was overjoyed and gave orders to lift Daniel out of the den. And when Daniel was lifted from the den, no wound was found on him, because he had trusted in his God. At the king's command, the men who had falsely accused Daniel were brought in and thrown into the lion's den. The lions missed a line, along with their wives and children. Now this might sound extremely cruel, and granted it was. It's kind of like a way of saying, I hate you so much, and I want to bring so much judgment against you that I'm not only killing you, I'm also killing your wives and children to make sure you have no descendants, and that your genealogical line is absolutely stomped out and will not continue. That's a big statement, and obviously Cyrus was probably not a real Jew or a believer in God at this point. He obviously knew something about God, but he wasn't necessarily. His actions here aren't to be emulated, but but yeah, that's what he does here. He just basically stomps out them and their descendants, bringing very, very serious judgment against these guys who were trying to accuse Daniel. make a big statement. He's basically saying, hey, these guys are definitely corrupt. I don't want them in government. I want to stomp these guys out and not let them go about anymore. Like, these guys are horrible. I can't stand them. So it says, the king's command, the men who had falsely accused Daniel were brought in, thrown into the lion's den along with their wives and children. And before they reached the floor of the den, the lions overpowered them and crushed all their bones. So in other words, it was quite miraculous that Daniel was spared, and yet as soon as he's brought out and these guys are thrown in and they're eaten. It's not that these lions had been full and not wanting to eat anything when Daniel was around, but then no, they were ready to eat, it seems like. Very much so, if they're ready to eat this whole family or multiple families. Verse 25, it says, Then King Darius wrote to all the nations and peoples of every language in all the earth. And then here's what he writes. And I think here is the main point of this passage. If you take nothing else, what we've covered up to this point is the main story of what happened. But here's the conclusion of the point that we're supposed to learn from this. This is what Cyrus learned from it. And this is, I think, what the writer of this passage is trying to communicate the same thing to us as well and say, hey, here's the point. Here's what we're supposed to learn. So what are we supposed to learn? Okay, well, here's his message to the various peoples around the world. He says, may you prosper greatly. That's probably his greeting, blessings. He says, I issue a decree that in every part of my kingdom, people must fear and reverence the God of Daniel. For he is the living God, and he endures forever. His kingdom will not be destroyed. His dominion will never end. He rescues and he saves. He performs signs and wonders in the heavens and on the earth. He has rescued Daniel from the power of the lions. And then the last sentence, it says, So Daniel prospered during the reign of Darius. That is the reign of Cyrus the Persian. So what do we take from this? I think there's kind of three main ideas that he's getting at in this last little bit, where he's basically summarizing what we can learn from this whole passage of Daniel being delivered from this den of lions. The first thing is, as he says there, verse 26, for he is the living God. And actually, if you remember, about halfway through this chapter, he refers to him as the living God as well. So, he is the living God. And what does that mean to be the living God? He's alive, he's active, he's at work, he's actually doing stuff. Some people imagine God as someone who just puts stuff into motion and then leaves and goes away. Or especially back in those days where they believe in a lot of these idols, it's like they pray to them, they try and worship them, they try and chant and make all kinds of noise and sacrifices to these things. And yet they usually feel like they're completely ignored and don't get the attention of the gods, and so they have to do more stuff to try and get their attention. I think a lot of them realize, these gods really are not alive and active, or they're not really involved. If they're real, they're not really that involved in the world. Whereas the God of Daniel, he's alive. He's the living God. He's the God who is actually at work, involved in the world and doing stuff. He's alive. Unlike these other gods. To call him the living God almost implies that all the other gods are dead. Which, pretty true. So I think the first point is, our God is the living God. And of course, in the case of Daniel, he proved that and showing up and doing this miraculous thing. And for us today, we still see this to be true. God is still at work. He's still transforming our lives. Even earlier in this worship service, we had a great testimony of how God is transforming someone's life and doing great works even today. In fact, for our last number of worship service videos, as you guys have been sharing your videos, we've had so many examples of how God is alive and at work. He is the living God. Very different from what we see in many other religions, where it's like God is so distant. God does not relate with people according to other religions. And of course, in their experience, how can you have a relationship with a God who isn't really there, isn't listening. But we have a God who is there. That's why we emphasize this relationship with God, because that's a real thing. It happens. We experience it. We know it to be true. We see him at work. He is the living God. I know in India, there was one church planter who that was his favorite title. He loved to refer to God as the living God. Because, in India, they believe in so many different gods. And so he loved latching onto this title here, calling him the living God. Because, again, our God is unique. He is alive and active. He reigns supreme. And that kind of leads us to the next point. What's the second thing that Darius or Cyrus is pointing out here about God? He says, he is the living God, in verse 26, and he endures forever. His kingdom will not be destroyed, and his dominion will never end. So there's kind of the second point. His reign is eternal. It doesn't end. It goes on forever. He's always in control. Now, how would Darius have known that? He might have only had a very limited exposure to Daniel's God here in this event. Perhaps he had heard stories of what God had done even during the time of the Babylonian reign over the Israelites there. That's quite possible, but somehow he's had enough evidence here to know, wow, this God of Daniel, he's powerful. And it's not just this one isolated incident. He must have been aware that, no, this is an enduring thing. He's always in control. You may have heard how God was in control even while the Babylonians were reigning over the Israelites, and yet he's humble enough to acknowledge that. At least he's humble enough at this stage of his life. So his dominion never ends, and we can see even more evidence. We have far more evidence of this than even Darius would have had. We have so many stories throughout the time of Scripture and even throughout church history, and even in present day. God is on his throne. He is still in control. And that's why even though our world today is so chaotic and seems so uncertain and the future seems so unclear, yet we still can rest easy and have peace, trusting that God is in control. Because we've seen throughout history, God is always in control. And even when things seem bad or chaotic, God still shows himself to be in control. So we can trust, just like Daniel, just like Darius, that yes, God is on his throne. His dominion never ends. He is a living God, and his dominion never ends. And what's the third big point that Darius makes here? Verse 27, he rescues and he saves. He performs signs and wonders in the heavens and on earth, and he has rescued Daniel from the power of the lions. So that's another thing. He rescues. He saves. And specifically in the case of Daniel, he saved him from these lions. But he also makes this general statement. This God, this living God whose dominion never ends, he's a God who rescues and saves. And again, he may have had stories even of what happened under the Babylonians and how even God rescued and saved Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego from the fiery furnace. Or maybe other stories as well. I don't know what all he knew. But he definitely knew that our God is a God who rescues and saves. And of course, in the case of Daniel, that's very clear how he did it. Now, what about us today? Does God still rescue and save us in every way? Whenever we want it? However we want? That's actually a good question, right? Does God always save us from harm in every incident? Here Daniel seems to be indicating, look, God rescued me because I trusted in him. So if we trust in God, will he always deliver us? Well, according to the New Testament, I guess you could say no or yes, depending on how you look at it, really. Let me explain that a little bit more. Does God, according to what we see in the New Testament, according to what Jesus even teaches us, does God always protect us from harm in this world? No, he doesn't. In fact, according to Jesus, if we follow him, we can expect to suffer. He assured his followers that they would suffer even persecution, just as he himself suffered. So we can expect the same. So should we expect that God is always going to protect us from suffering and take us out of harm's way in this world? No. Sometimes he does. Don't get me wrong. He definitely sometimes does. And here in the book of Daniel, that's a good example. And we have other examples in the New Testament too, where he miraculously saves people. So he does work in that way sometimes, but not always. But if you look at it not from a perspective of what happens in this world, but from the eternal side of things, then you would have to say yes. According to what we see in the New Testament, God always does, will for sure, 100% protect us from harm in time to come. If we put our faith in him, we trust in him, our lives are secure in him. We have promises that he will save us from sin and from death. He will protect us from all the harm that we need to be protected from. So again, not necessarily all the harm we want to be protected from in this world, but he will, for sure, protect his people. Those who put their faith and trust in him, he will, for sure, protect his people from eternal harm. So, yes, he is a God who rescues and saves. And he shows it in a very physical way here with Daniel, protecting him from physical harm. And what I think is really cool is the story of Daniel in the lion's den is actually a really, really good physical example of our spiritual reality. So Daniel, he had this physical example where he basically had to trust in God. He had to, he basically had to put his faith in God in order to follow God. And because he put his faith in God, his life was spared, and the people who opposed God, they were put to death and destroyed. Think about it. How does that correspond with our spiritual reality? That's almost exactly what we face spiritually, right? That is. It's a great example of everything we're taught in the gospel message. That if we put our faith and trust in God, we will be spared and we will have eternal life. But if we oppose God, we will get the judgment we deserve. We will face death. Again, Daniel's story is a great physical example of the spiritual reality that we can count on. In fact, there's a lot of ways in that the Old Testament, it basically gives us a physical picture or example or pattern of the gospel message that Jesus came and proclaimed. And I don't think it's any coincidence that this story matches so closely with the gospel message. Again, it's a wonderful illustration that if we trust in God, even though it might seem crazy, even though it might seem dangerous, even though whatever, still, we can trust that yes, God will save us eternally. He will give us eternal life. He will come through. He is the God who rescues and saves. But all who oppose him will get the judgment they deserve. That's the good news of the gospel. We can be saved. He is a God who rescues. Let's trust in him and put our faith in him, even though the world might persecute us for it, even though the world might hate us for it. God can be trusted, and he will rescue and save. So, to put it all together, basically our God is the living God, as he says in verse 26, and then he goes on to say his dominion never ends. He's always on his throne. And then third, he rescues and saves. Those are the three big points that I think this story is trying to illustrate to us. Our God is a God who, he's a living God. His dominion never ends, and he rescues and saves. All right, so those are the big things we can learn. Now, to try and apply this more to our situation today, like what we're actually facing, I want to just reflect a little bit on Daniel's actions. His actions of putting his faith in God and continuing to pray to God, continuing to follow God and trusting God, even though he knew that could potentially put his life in jeopardy. His actions proved that he believed the truth. He knew that God is a God who rescues and saves. He knew that God is worth serving. He knew that God is in control and that his dominion never ends. He knew that God is a living God who is alive and active in this world. Because he knew that, it makes sense that he would continue to serve God and follow God. That was probably a no-brainer for him because he knew the truth. about God. So, do our actions also prove that we believe that this is true? Do our actions show that we believe that God is trustworthy, that God is worth living for and dying for? Do our actions prove that we believe that God is the living God who is alive and active? Do our actions prove that we really believe that God is on his throne, that he is in control? Do our actions prove that we really believe God rescues and saves? Now, we might not have to actually decide between our lives and following God. We don't face the kind of persecution that many Christians in different parts of the world face. But even if we don't face that kind of a decision, we face a lot of other decisions. Here in America, we might not have so many false idols or gods in the sense of an actual thing that we bow down and worship and sing praises to. But we do have a lot of false idols and gods of worldly things that we devote our lives to, devote our time and energy and resources to, that are not of God. Are we willing to really be faithful to God? Let me put it this way. Daniel, he was willing to risk his life and sacrifice even his earthly life and well-being for the sake of being faithful to God. Are we also willing to make sacrifices and sacrifice our earthly well-being or our earthly comforts or whatever else in order to follow God and be faithful to him? Again, we might not have to choose between our lives and following God, but I'm pretty certain that all of us at times will have to decide between our physical comfort and following God. Are we willing to sacrifice our comfort for the sake of following God? I'm pretty sure all of us at some point will have to sacrifice our own selfish plans and dreams for the sake of following God. Are we willing to do that? To lay down our own selfish wants and desires and to follow God? I'm pretty sure that a lot of us, if not all of us, will at some point have to decide between even our reputation and following God. Are we willing to sacrifice the way people think about us and other people's view of us for the sake of being faithful to God? Look, again, we might not have to make a decision between our life and following God like Daniel had to, but we all, I think every day, have to make decisions on, really, do we trust God? Is he worth living for? Are we willing to sacrifice the comforts and pleasures and things of this world for the sake of being faithful to God and living for him? He's worth it. Look, if we really believe that he is the living God and that his dominion never ends and that he saves and rescues and that, that he's going to bring us to this eternal glory and bring us to salvation and all that we could ever want and hope for and dream for, he's worth it. Look, if we really believe that, it's a no-brainer. Just like it was a no-brainer for Daniel. Of course I'm going to keep following God. It should be the same way for us. If we really believe it, our actions will show it. Do we really believe that our God is the living God? Do we really believe that his dominion never ends? Do we really believe that he rescues and saves? Let's believe. Let's trust him. Will you join me in prayer? Father, we thank you so much for all that you have done. We thank you for sending your Son into this world to die on the cross so that we can be forgiven and that we can have new life in you. We thank you for your sacrifice. Help us to be willing to sacrifice as well, knowing that you are worth it, knowing that you are so worth it, knowing that all the things this world has to offer cannot even begin to compare with what you are wanting to give us. Help us to trust you and to truly believe. Father, we just pray that you would transform our lives. And as we're confronted with tough decisions where we have to choose between this world and following you, Help us to believe so firmly that it's a no-brainer for us, that we will just automatically want to serve you. Help us to truly believe your truth. We pray in Jesus' name. Amen.